So, we are now in the 20th century. We are an immigrant nation, assimilating immigrants through a variety of processes, but particularly through mandatory public education. Pretty much any American man who's a citizen over the age of 21 can vote. But the society has become more industrialized. In fact, by the 1920s, more Americans will live in towns than in the countryside. And that's a big change. Heralding this change is a difference of opinion about the role of women. Traditionally, women have not been participants in the political process. But that's changing. In the United States in the late 1800s, one of the truly powerful movements was called Prohibition. Prohibition was the elimination of legal buying, selling, and using of alcoholic beverages, of booze, of beer, wine, and spirits. Carrie Nation was an American woman who famously, with her axe and a bunch of harridan, scary warrior women, would break into saloons and bars and start smashing up the casks of beer and wine and breaking the spirit bottles. Why? Because she didn't like drunk people. Who does? She didn't like that a lot of crimes are committed by people under the influence of alcohol. She didn't like, and a lot of others didn't like, the fact that drunk people can be abusive, sometimes violently so, and that a lot of the physical and psychological and emotional abuse that families have can be traced to a guy drinking a little too much or a lot too much and losing his control and having his inner beast come out and plague everyone around him. So, the Prohibition movement is one case where women come together and lead a movement that involves churchmen and that involves all sorts of other people and that convinces a number of American men to vote for dry counties. That's counties within a state that has no alcohol bought, sold, or used, according to the law, or that would vote an entire state to become dry. And ultimately, just before this amendment, and the 18th Amendment is passed, which prohibits the sale of alcohol or the use of alcohol anywhere within these United States. We've already talked about the effects of prohibition. Hello, organized crime. But anyway, so by 1919, after the relief, or during the swelling of relief that we feel after the victorious end of World War I, a new amendment to the Constitution is going to be passed that's going to grant adult women over the age of 21 who are American citizens, the right to vote. This is passed in August of 1920, the 19th Amendment, and women who are citizens, both black and white, are allowed to vote. The first presidential election they vote for is 1920 for Warren G. Harding over, Cox, a Democrat named Cox, I think. Yeah. Anyway, so we've now expanded the franchise from propertied men over 21 who are citizens or are of European stock to include men and women of every race who are citizens over the age of 21. But in the South, Jim Crow prevents that dream from being fully realized. In the 1940s and 50s and early 60s, a civil rights movement develops of blacks and whites and other Americans of a variety of backgrounds who come together with the idea that the victory in the Civil War has been betrayed by Jim Crow laws and that equal rights need to come to the American South. So, in 1964, a year before I was born, the Civil Rights Act is passed, which is going to eliminate all legal forms of discrimination and make it against the law to discriminate against people on the basis of their sex. On the basis of their race or ethnic heritage. In 1965, An adjunct to this called the Voting Rights Act is passed and signed into law by President Lyndon Johnson. And this is going to mandate changes in voting laws and voting regulations that get rid of such things as literacy tests and the poll tax. Now you might say, how can a literacy test be bad for a voter? After all, if voters are supposed to inform themselves, they should be able to read and write. Well, literacy tests were used by Southern politicians to keep black people off the rolls. Basically, if Cletus the slack-jawed yokel, a stereotypical Southern white with no real education, wanted to vote, he'd be passed. But if a black fellow who lived half a mile down the road from him wanted to vote, they would force him to demonstrate a mastery of written English that most college graduates would have trouble with. In other words, an uneven standard allows effectively the separation of blacks from the voting rolls. The poll tax was also designed to keep blacks from voting. If you had a poor white who wanted to vote, especially if they wanted to vote Democrat, they would be provided with the money for the poll tax. Not so with blacks. So these corrupt practices are outlawed by the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which effectively ends the Jim Crow laws. Finally, we come to almost modern times. By the mid to late Vietnam War, which includes 1970 and 71 when this amendment was floated, Americans were fighting in combat. The average age of the American combat soldier in Vietnam was 19. In fact, people who were not able to vote fought and died in World War I, in the Banana Wars, in World War II, in Korea, and had been dying in Vietnam. And the statement is made, if you're old enough to die for your country, you should be old enough to vote. So that statement, plus certain politicians seeing an advantage in getting young people to vote who might be liberal and anti-war and might vote a certain way, produces the 1971 26th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which lowers the voting age from 21 to 18 nationally. So now any citizen who is a man or a woman over the age of 18, or who is going to be 18 or older on election day, has the right to vote. So see how the franchise has expanded. The last video in this subsection is going to ask a question for you to deliberate and debate upon.